In 1972, the United States experienced an unusual wave of airplane hijackings. One of the most notorious incidents involved Garrett Trapnell, who, armed with a pistol, demanded $300,000 and a meeting with President Nixon. Another criminal, Richard LaPointe, threatened to detonate a bomb hidden in a suitcase, requesting $50,000 and 2 parachutes. After receiving the ransom, he simply jumped out of the plane. Over the course of that year, there were 15 similar hijackings, an unprecedented phenomenon that had no parallel before or since. However, the reasons behind this bizarre surge in hijackings were more complex than mere greed, as all the hijackers were apprehended and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The exception to this pattern occurred on November 24, 1971, when a man known only as D.B. Cooper executed a hijacking, displayed a bomb, received a substantial ransom, parachuted out of the aircraft, and vanished without a trace. This incident remains the only unsolved case of air piracy in American history. Was it sheer luck, a meticulously crafted plan executed flawlessly, or perhaps a tragedy that consumed the hijacker? Let's delve into the mystery. At the beginning of 1980, a boy named Brian was enjoying a family vacation at the Columbia River. While attempting to build a fire, he stumbled upon 3 plastic bags filled with cash. In total, there was $5,800, a significant amount for that time. The condition of the bills indicated they had been buried for quite some time, likely several years. Brian showed his discovery to his parents, who promptly turned the money over to the police. The authorities in turn notified the FBI. It turned out that the money discovered was part of the ransom given to the mysterious hijacker D.B. Cooper. He received $200,000, and the serial numbers of all the bills were registered and tracked nationwide. The packages found by Brian became the only recovered money from the total ransom. The story of D.B. Cooper has captivated generations of Americans. The tale of a man who hijacked a plane and made off with a fortune is both alluring and enigmatic. Like any open-ended mystery, we revisit this story time and again, speculating about what really happened behind the scenes, yet we may never know the truth. This is why Cooper has become a part of American culture. Books and films about him continue to emerge, with authors claiming to have unraveled his mystery. Cooper's image periodically appears in movies. For instance, in the series Loki, it's suggested that D.B. Cooper was actually Loki himself, while David Lynch named the protagonist of Twin Peaks Dale Cooper in homage to this enigmatic hijacker. Now, let's delve into the story itself. Every detail of the events that unfolded on November 24, 1971, aboard a Boeing flying from Portland to Seattle, has been examined meticulously. I'll do my best to provide a detailed account and explain each aspect. A modest man, around 45 years old, arrived at Portland International Airport. He was dressed in a business suit, a white shirt, and a black tie, holding a briefcase in his hands. After purchasing a $20 ticket for Flight 305 to Seattle with cash, he proceeded to board the plane. Cooper took seat 18E in the last row and ordered a bourbon and 7-Up from the flight attendant. The plane was not very crowded, carrying only 36 passengers along with 6 crew members. It took off at 3:00 p.m. Once the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Cooper summoned the flight attendant and handed her a note. Flight attendant Florence Schaffner initially dismissed it, thinking the passenger was simply trying to make a connection and leave his phone number. She tucked the paper into her pocket without reading it. However, Cooper leaned in closer and said, "Miss, you better look at that note, I have a bomb." Startled, Florence unfolded the note and read the message. "I have a bomb in my briefcase, and I will use it if I feel it's necessary. I want you to sit next to me." This isn't a verbatim quote, as the flight attendant recalled the content from memory. Cooper handed the note back, and Florence noted that the text was written in blue ink and in all capital letters, likely done to make it harder to identify his handwriting. She took a seat next to him and asked Cooper to show her the bomb. He opened his briefcase and revealed something that resembled explosives. Red cylinders, similar to dynamite, along with wires and a battery. After ensuring that the flight attendant believed in the seriousness of his intentions, he made a series of demands: $200,000 in $20 bills, equivalent to about $1.3 million today, and 2 parachutes. Florence nodded and returned to the cockpit to inform the captain of the situation. He immediately contacted ground control to report the hijacking. Captain Scott ordered Florence to remain in the cockpit until the flight was completed and to document everything in the logbook. While Florence Schaffner was in the cockpit, flight attendant Tina Mucklow sat next to Cooper, serving as a liaison between him and the rest of the crew. By that point, Cooper had already put on dark sunglasses. He then made additional demands. After landing at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, SeaTac, fuel trucks were to be ready, and the passengers were to remain seated until Mucklow delivered the money on board. He stated that he would only release the passengers after receiving the ransom. Cooper also specified that the last items that needed to be on board were 4 parachutes. Captain Scott informed the tower at SeaTac, which then contacted the Seattle Police Department, SPD, and the FBI. The passengers were informed that the flight to Seattle was delayed due to a minor mechanical issue. Donald Nierop, the then president of Northwest Airlines, approved the ransom payment and instructed all staff to cooperate with the hijacker by fulfilling his demands. Flight 305 circled over Puget Sound for about 2 hours to give the SPD and FBI time to prepare the ransom and parachutes, as well as to mobilize emergency services. During the flight from Portland to Seattle, Cooper insisted that Mucklow stay close to him. Later, she noted that Cooper seemed to be familiar with the area. When the plane flew over Tacoma, he remarked, "That's Tacoma down there." When he was told that the parachutes would be brought from McCord Air Force Base, Cooper accurately pointed out that it was only about 20 minutes away from SeaTac. Tina Mucklow later described his demeanor, saying, "Cooper did not exhibit any nervousness. He seemed quite polite and was not aggressive or rude." As the plane continued to circle over Seattle, Tina asked Cooper, "You chose our company to hijack because you have a grudge against them." He laughed and replied, "It's not because I have a grudge against your airlines, it's just because I have a grudge." He then explained that the flight simply suited his needs. He inquired about her background. She mentioned she was from Pennsylvania but lived in Minneapolis. Cooper acknowledged that Minnesota was a very nice place. When she asked him where he was from, he became somber and chose not to answer. Cooper also asked if she smoked and offered her a cigarette. She replied that she had quit but accepted his offer. On the ground, authorities were at a loss about how to handle the situation. They had never dealt with a hijacker like this before. The dispatcher informed the authorities and the airline's management, and after a brief consultation, it was decided to comply with the hijacker's demands to avoid putting the passengers at risk. As the police began to gather at Seattle Airport, FBI agents worked to procure the money and parachutes. The bills were carefully photographed and neatly arranged in bundles. Cooper rejected the parachutes that were originally planned to be taken from the military base, demanding civilian parachutes instead. These were successfully located at a local flight school. Meanwhile, the passengers on board were unaware of what was happening. They were informed over the intercom that the landing was delayed due to technical issues. The plane circled the city for 2 hours, but Cooper remained completely calm. He joked, asked for drinks and food, and even paid for all the orders himself. The flight attendant noted that Cooper did not resemble the typical criminal. He made no threats, was courteous, and did not resort to any violence. This was unusual, as prior hijackers had either been frantic or ideologically driven revolutionaries aiming to flee to Cuba. In comparison to such individuals, Cooper appeared to be a true gentleman. Another interesting detail was that Cooper seemed quite knowledgeable about the area. He correctly identified the city of Tacoma when he saw it through the window and noted that an Air Force base was nearby. The plane landed in Seattle once the FBI was able to fulfill all of Cooper's demands. By this time, it was getting dark outside, and the hijacker ordered the cabin window shades to be drawn and the lights to be turned off so that police and snipers wouldn't have a clear shot. This fact suggests that Cooper likely had some understanding of how special operations are conducted. Only one airline employee approached the plane on the ground, carrying a briefcase with the money and a parachute.
According to Cooper's instructions, Mucklow exited the plane through the front door to retrieve the ransom. When she returned, she carried the bag of money past the seated passengers and handed it to Cooper, who was in the last row. After this, Cooper agreed to let the passengers go. Once they were disembarked, Cooper examined the money. In an attempt to ease the tension, Mucklow jokingly asked Cooper if she could take some of the money. Cooper readily agreed and handed her a bundle of bills, but she immediately returned the cash, explaining that accepting tips was against company policy. She noted that earlier in the flight, Cooper had tried to give tips to her and 2 other flight attendants from his pocket, but they had all refused, citing company policy. After the passengers were safely off the plane, only Cooper and 6 crew members remained on board. Following Cooper's demands, Mucklow made 3 trips outside the plane to collect the parachutes, which she brought to him in the back of the aircraft. While Mucklow was bringing the parachutes on board, Schaffner asked Cooper if she could retrieve her handbag stored in the compartment behind his seat. Cooper agreed, telling her, "I won't bite." Then flight attendant Alice Hancock asked Cooper if the flight attendants could leave, to which he replied, "You girls can do whatever you want." So Hancock and Schaffner disembarked. When Mucklow brought Cooper the last parachute, she handed him a printed instruction manual for using the parachutes, but Cooper said he didn't need it. Following his instructions, Mucklow left the plane through the front door to collect the ransom. When she returned, she carried the bag of money past the seated passengers and handed it to Cooper in the last row. After that, Cooper agreed to release the passengers. Meanwhile, a fuel truck arrived to refuel the airplane. At this moment, Cooper explained to the crew the next steps of his plan. He didn't just vaguely state that they were heading to Mexico, he detailed specific aspects of the route and the plan. According to Cooper's instructions, the plane was to take off and maintain a course to Mexico City at minimum speed and altitude. For the Boeing, this speed was 185 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 3,000 meters above ground. The landing gear was to remain lowered and flaps were to be set at 15 degrees. A debate arose between Cooper and the pilots about this configuration. They informed him that the aircraft would not make it to Mexico on 1 tank of fuel under those conditions. After some negotiations, they agreed to make a stop in Reno for refueling. However, Cooper made another surprising request. He insisted on taking off with the aft staircase deployed. They responded that this was unsafe, but Cooper countered, saying, "It can be done, do it." Although he did not press the issue further and mentioned that he would lower the staircase once they were airborne. Cooper demanded that Mucklow stay aboard to assist with the operation. This was the only moment when the hijacker showed signs of nervousness. He felt that the refueling was taking too long and threatened to detonate the bomb. In reality, the refueling was indeed taking longer than anticipated, but not due to any attempts by the FBI to prolong the process. A fuel delivery mechanism on the truck had broken down and needed urgent repairs. During the delay, Mucklow reported that Cooper complained that the money had been delivered in a cloth bag instead of a backpack as he had ordered, forcing him to come up with a new way to carry the cash. Using a pocket knife, he cut the canopy of one of the reserve parachutes and stuffed some of the money into an empty parachute bag. At approximately 7:40 p.m., the Boeing took off for the second time. Following the plane, 2 fighter jets were dispatched, flying strictly behind the Boeing so that Cooper could not see them through the porthole. As soon as the plane reached the required altitude, Cooper ordered all crew members to lock themselves in the cockpit. He then asked Mucklow to lower the aft staircase. She expressed her concerns and mentioned that she was afraid she might be thrown out of the plane. The crew suggested she go into the cockpit to retrieve an emergency cord that she could use to secure herself to her seat. However, Cooper refused, stating that he did not want her to go forward while the crew returned to the cabin. Despite this, Mucklow continued to voice her fears and asked Cooper to cut a length of rope from one of the parachutes to make a safety tether. He insisted that he would lower the staircase himself and ordered her to go to the cockpit, close the curtain between the economy class and first class, and not return. Before leaving, Mucklow pleaded with Cooper, saying, "Please, please take the bomb with you." Cooper responded that he would either disarm it or take it with him. As she approached the cockpit and turned to close the curtain, she saw Cooper standing in the aisle, tying what appeared to be a bag of money around his waist. Only 4 to 5 minutes had passed since takeoff when Mucklow entered the cockpit. For the rest of the flight, Tina Mucklow stayed in the cockpit and became the last person to see Cooper. The pilots continued to fly the aircraft in silence until 20 minutes later, the indicator for the lowering of the aft staircase lit up. The pilot contacted Cooper via intercom and asked if he needed assistance, but Cooper sharply declined. 13 minutes later, the plane suddenly swayed, and the pilots struggled to regain stability. After that, communication with Cooper was lost. The Boeing safely landed at Reno Airport, where it was met by FBI agents. By that time, it was clear to everyone that Cooper had likely jumped out, but they thoroughly checked the cabin just in case. From this point on, the real story of D.B. Cooper concludes. Officially, he was never seen again. What follows is a detective chronicle that continued for 45 years. Before positing any hypotheses, let's focus on the evidence. On board the aircraft, 66 unidentified fingerprints were found, along with a black tie and a tie clip that presumably belonged to Cooper. In the ashtray on the armrest of seat 18E, FBI agents discovered 8 Raleigh filter cigarette butts. The butts were sent to the FBI's forensic lab, but investigators were unable to find any fingerprints and returned them to the evidence locker in Las Vegas. In 1998, the FBI attempted to extract DNA from the butts, but found that they had been destroyed during storage in the Las Vegas evidence locker. The agents found 2 hair samples on Cooper's seat, 1 hair from a hand and 1 brown hair from the head of a person of Caucasian descent on the headrest. The hair from the hand was destroyed after the FBI criminal lab concluded that the sample lacked sufficient unique microscopic characteristics to be useful in the investigation. However, the head hair was deemed suitable for future comparisons and was preserved on a microscope slide. When the FBI tried to create a DNA profile of Cooper in 2002, they discovered that the hair sample had been lost. Additionally, 2 used parachutes were found, one of which had its harness cut, likely for tying up the money. Interestingly, the hijacker chose an older parachute for the jump, and the reserve parachute was found to be inoperable. An experienced parachutist would have immediately noticed the differences. Nothing else was discovered on the plane. However, the FBI was provided with their first suspect. Agents decided to check the real D.B. Cooper in case the hijacker had used his real name. Within a few hours, they confirmed his innocence. Moreover, the hijacker had signed up for the flight as Dan Cooper, not D.B., but the sensational nature of the crime meant that journalists overlooked the details. Consequently, he was referred to as D.B. Cooper in the morning paper. Other newspapers followed suit, and by the time the error was discovered, it was too late. The criminal would forever remain in the public consciousness as D.B. Cooper. Nevertheless, this distinction does not matter. He still used a pseudonym, and it is irrelevant under what name he entered history. After that, the search began for the location where Cooper might have landed. The main challenge was that no one could accurately determine the moment he exited the plane. Neither the crew members nor the fighter pilots trailing the Boeing noticed the jump. Investigators attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events and concluded that he likely jumped at 8:13 p.m. when the aircraft suddenly jolted. At that moment, the Boeing was flying through a heavy downpour, which meant no one saw Cooper exit the plane. Even with the exact jump time known, pinpointing the landing site proved problematic. A minor error in estimating the plane's speed, altitude, or weather conditions could lead to significant inaccuracies, potentially spanning several miles. Additionally, it was unclear how long Cooper spent in freefall. The primary search area was established on the southern slope of Mount St. Helens. Local police and FBI agents scoured dozens of square miles of forest on foot, while helicopters surveyed the area from the air. Searches were conducted not only in the woods but also on farms and along local rivers, yet no traces were found, no leads whatsoever. The search was then moved to a neighboring state where hundreds of people examined suspicious broken tree branches and pieces of plastic discovered in dense underbrush. The outcome was the same: 0 results. At that time, authorities decided to mobilize all possible resources to find Cooper. From January to April 1972, the most extensive search operation in U.S. history unfolded, involving thousands of FBI agents, National Guard soldiers, and local volunteers. They even deployed a submarine in the search efforts. In one of the abandoned cabins, the skeleton of a girl who had been kidnapped a few weeks earlier was discovered, but no evidence of Cooper was found. A month after the hijacking, the FBI sent lists of the stolen money to all banks, casinos, and betting agencies. Furthermore, they did not limit their efforts to the U.S. and sent the serial numbers to intelligence agencies in several countries. When this also yielded no results, it was decided to publish the serial numbers of the bills publicly. The airline announced a $25,000 reward for anyone who could assist in capturing Cooper. One incident even led to a humorous situation. 2 men forged the serial numbers of several bills and attempted to claim the reward in exchange for information about the alleged hijacker, but they were quickly caught. Over the next 2 years, several newspapers offered rewards for information about Cooper. But as is often the case, this did not yield any results. The editorial offices began receiving letters from people claiming that they were the ones who hijacked the plane. There were a total of 6 such letters. There may have been more, but the 6 that are known varied greatly in style and contained nothing remarkable. One letter claimed that the police composite sketch of D.B. Cooper was incorrect and that he looked different. Another stated that Cooper was living peacefully in his hometown. The most interesting letter was sent on December 11, 1971, to 4 major newspapers in the U.S., but it was not published until many years later. This may have happened because the FBI initially took it more seriously than the others, since the author, instead of mocking the police, delved into deep reflections on the meaning of life. Allow me to quote its contents. "I am not a modern Robin Hood. Unfortunately, I have 14 months left to live. Hijacking the airplane was the quickest and most profitable way for me to secure the last days of my life. I robbed the airline not because I found it romantic or heroic. I do not condemn those who hate me for my actions or those who would like to see me caught. I had no doubt that I wouldn't be caught. I've flown several times on various routes and have no intention of hiding in some abandoned town. In my life, I have never received a parking ticket." This is not a verbatim account, but it generally illustrates that to this day, none of the letters supposedly written by Cooper are recognized as authentic. This letter does indeed appear to be the most credible, as it aligns best with the existing evidence. The criminal has yet to be found, and it is quite reasonable to assume that he may have died shortly after. Cooper seemingly appeared out of nowhere. His identity remains unknown despite the presence of fingerprints, which indicates that he had not previously been on the police radar. The tone of the letter is calm and restrained, matching the descriptions of Cooper's character based on the flight attendants' testimonies. However, I must reiterate that despite these indirect correlations, there are no grounds to consider the letter authentic. Does this mean that the search has officially hit a dead end? Not at this point. Exactly 7 years later, 20 kilometers from the primary search area, a hunter discovered a placard with instructions for lowering the rear stairs of a Boeing 727. This was a significant breakthrough, as it allowed investigators to reassess the data and establish that, in fact, Cooper was not being searched for in the correct location. Volunteers from across the country responded to the renewed search effort, but the only noteworthy discovery was the package that, as you recall, was accidentally found by a small boy. A month after these events, Mount St. Helens erupted. Since we have no other evidence, let us take a closer look at the money that the boy unearthed from the sand. The money was bundled in 3 stacks and secured with a rubber band in the same order that Cooper had received it. Although they appeared untouched, one of the stacks was missing 10 bills. Hydrologic engineers studied the find and concluded that the bag of money had ended up in the sand naturally, meaning it had not been intentionally buried. It is possible that the bag of money went into the water, floated downstream, and was then washed ashore. If this is the case, later investigations revealed that the packages contained traces of diatoms, which would unlikely have formed there if Cooper had lost the money immediately after the jump. Recall that the hijacking took place in November, while these algae begin to bloom only in spring. Thus, the money could have entered the water only several months after the crime. Additionally, experts found that the rubber bands used to secure the stacks should have rotted and decayed after 9 years in the water, yet they remained in fairly good condition. Let's suppose Cooper did indeed lose the bag of money during the jump. He could have landed near the river, and then in the spring, it was washed into the river and buried in the sand. Okay, but then where did the 10 bills go? The simplest explanation is that the boy took them, wanting to keep part of the treasure for himself. But this does not account for why the rubber bands remained intact over such a long period. Some even suggested that Cooper buried the money somewhere else, and some animal accidentally brought it to the river. There were also those who did not believe that the money ended up in the sand by chance, claiming that Cooper knew he wouldn't be able to spend the money, so he deliberately hid it. But if that were the case, the question arises, why steal it in the first place? 6 years later, the find was divided equally between Brian's family and the insurance company. The FBI retained 14 bills as evidence in the case. In 2008, the now-grown Brian sold several of his bills for $37,000. The investigation effectively stagnated for many years, but that does not mean the FBI lacked suspects. The agency checked numerous individuals, and some even claimed to have apprehended the real Cooper. However, the absence of direct evidence prevented any definitive conclusions from being reached. In 2009, paleontologist Tom Kay assembled a group of activists to reanalyze the case materials using modern technologies that had not been available in the previous 40 years. Although they did not uncover anything significant, they discovered numerous microparticles on the tie clip. These particles formed an entire periodic table including bismuth, aluminum, lycopodium from pharmaceuticals, and pure titanium. It can be surmised that Cooper had ties to the metallurgical industry. Titanium in the 1970s was much rarer than it is today, and could only be found in metallurgical or chemical plants. It is likely that Cooper was not a simple worker, but held a managerial or engineering position, as those individuals were the ones who wore suits while on factory premises. Later, rare earth metals were discovered, including strontium, which was a significant find, given that this element was actively used by Boeing in its project to create a supersonic aircraft during the 1970s. Recall that Cooper hijacked a Boeing plane and was, therefore, well acquainted with its technical specifications. This leads to the suggestion that Cooper could have been an employee of Boeing. However, this is where the evidence ends. Thus, let us piece together these fragmented details and try to create a profile of the criminal. Of course, I will not invent a description myself, but will take a real profile compiled by the FBI team. The physical description of Cooper remained unchanged and is considered reliable. Approximately 180 centimeters tall, weighing about 80 kilograms, around 40 years old, with dark skin and close-set brown eyes. Composite sketches were created based on the testimonies of the flight attendants. Now let's move on to the most important aspect, the parachute. Initially, the FBI's primary theory was that Cooper was a professional parachutist. However, certain issues arose. Firstly, as already mentioned, Cooper made a rather peculiar choice. The backup parachute was completely non-functional. It was a mannequin from a flight school that was accidentally given to Cooper. Nonetheless, his request for 2 sets of parachutes seemed reasonable. This created a risk that the hijacker might decide to jump with one of the hostages, thus safeguarding himself from receiving faulty parachutes. However, it seems quite unexpected that a true professional would not notice the marking on the mannequin. Secondly, Cooper chose a poor time for the jump. The plane flew through heavy rain, and the outside temperature reached -10 degrees Celsius. Moreover, Cooper was only dressed in a business suit, which made it completely unclear how he intended to survive in the cold and wet forest in such attire. However, if his parachuting skills could be considered to be of a low level, his knowledge of aircraft was at a high level. He selected the Boeing 727 because this aircraft was ideal for a jump, not just because of its convenient rear stairs, but also due to the fact that its engines were positioned high and at a safe distance from the parachutist. Additionally, this Boeing used a new single-point fueling system, allowing for faster refueling, which enabled flying slower and at lower altitudes compared to other commercial jets. Cooper also knew the exact timing for refueling the aircraft and was familiar with the nuances of flap settings. The question remains, where could he have learned such details about this aircraft? It is quite possible that immediately after committing the crime, Cooper returned to his homeland. Interestingly, the choice of date seems significant. The hijacking took place just before a long weekend, which may indicate that he knew he would need a lot of time to make his way out of the forest. With 4 days off instead of the usual 2, as for the motive, Cooper likely needed money urgently. Such crimes are too risky to commit without a serious necessity. Therefore, he may have found himself in a desperate situation. In 1976, the statute of limitations on this case might have expired, as neither people nor the aircraft were harmed. However, after lengthy discussions, the court still brought a charge against Dan Cooper for air piracy, meaning he was to be prosecuted at some point, regardless of when he was apprehended. Who could be hiding under the name Dan Cooper? Starting with one version, Cooper did not survive after his jump. Jumping in the rain, in darkness, and at sub-zero temperatures while only wearing a suit was an extremely risky decision. Even if he managed to land successfully, the question remains how he could survive in the forest for several days. This could only happen if he had an accomplice on the ground. The investigation into Cooper's case was officially closed in 2016, and it remains unsolved. However, the prevailing theory is his death, Nevertheless, this has not stopped the search for Cooper among the living. Over the span of 45 years, the FBI meticulously investigated more than 1,000 suspects, both in the immediate aftermath and those who, approaching the end of their lives, allegedly confessed to being Cooper. One of the theories I mentioned earlier is that Cooper actually worked for Boeing, but there is another possibility. These planes were used by the CIA during the Vietnam War, specifically designed for airborne operations. This raises the question of whether Cooper had any ties to the Air Force or the CIA. This possibility cannot be dismissed, primarily because during the hijacking, he demonstrated knowledge about a military base, information that is closed off to the general public. If we assume that Cooper participated in CIA airborne operations, it is conceivable that he was not a paratrooper, but rather a cargo plane pilot. This could explain why he knew everything about the Boeing 727's construction but was poorly prepared for the jump. There's also a possibility that Cooper was not an American. His choice of pseudonym is indicative of this. Dan Cooper is not just a random name, it is the name of a character from a popular Belgian comic, a test pilot, hero, and parachutist. Furthermore, these comics were never published in English. Is this a coincidence? Perhaps. However, there's another intriguing point. When Cooper spoke about the ransom, he asked for $200,000, specifying it as in American currency. In the US, dollars are typically not referred to in that manner, which makes it plausible to suggest that he might have been a foreigner. The only perplexing fact remained the absence of an accent. All these seemingly mysterious facts can be explained quite simply. Cooper could have been Canadian. In Canada, comics in foreign languages are indeed accessible, and there are specific terms for referring to dollars. This could explain why, after the hijacking, Cooper could not be found in the US. I won't go into detail about all the candidates, but let's consider the most interesting ones, even though that doesn't necessarily mean they are the most likely. Let's start with Jack Koffold, a small-time con artist who, in 1972, claimed to be Dan Cooper and attempted to sell his story to Hollywood through a friend. Koffold asserted that he had landed 80 kilometers away from where the search was conducted, was injured, and lost all the money. One might wonder why a criminal would reveal his identity and draw the attention of the FBI. Perhaps Koffold knew that the FBI wouldn't take his claim seriously, given the numerous inconsistencies in his story. Moreover, he was 10 years older than the suspected hijacker and bore little resemblance to the composite sketch. As a result, the FBI quickly lost interest in him, and soon after, Koffold passed away. However, that did not stop his friend from continuing to assert that Koffold was indeed the hijacker. Overall, this possibility likely lacks a solid foundation. But not all potential candidates were quite so unconvincing. Our next character is Richard McCoy Jr. He served as a pilot in Vietnam, later worked with the National Guard, and was an avid parachutist. But the most interesting part comes next. On April 7, 1972, Richard McCoy boarded a flight headed for Los Angeles and showed that he had a grenade. He demanded $500,000 and a parachute. The subsequent events unfolded exactly as they did in the Cooper case. After receiving the money and waiting for takeoff, McCoy jumped out over the forest. However, he was arrested just 2 days later. His fingerprints matched those left aboard the plane, and a bag of money was found at his home. McCoy was sentenced to 45 years in prison, but escaped after 2 years and was shot in a standoff with police. The agent who shot McCoy was convinced he had killed Cooper. Many might have thought that Cooper had indeed decided to repeat his successful crime. However, it soon became clear that there were about 15 hijackings recorded in 1972, all committed by different individuals, and most hijackers were caught fairly quickly. Therefore, the fact that Richard McCoy committed a similar crime does not automatically make him Cooper. Additionally, he did not fit the age description and was in Los Angeles on the day of the hijacking. So this option can also be ruled out. Now let's talk about Kenneth Christensen. He somehow ranks first on all the lists of suspects, which is surprising since the FBI only took interest in him in 2003, when C. Christensen had already been dead for 9 years. How did they come across him? The answer lies with his brother. In the early 2000s, he watched a documentary about the hijacking and concluded that Dan Cooper was his brother Kenneth. It is worth noting that during World War II, Kenneth underwent paratrooper training And after the Army, he worked for the very small airline whose plane Cooper hijacked. Moreover, he continued to work there until his retirement. When his brother saw the composite sketch, he noticed some similarities to Kenneth and began recalling strange coincidences. Dan Cooper was left-handed, and so was Kenneth. Cooper smoked and drank whiskey, just like Kenneth. In the 1970s, he bought a house with cash. When Kenneth passed away, a stash of gold coins was found among his belongings, and he had $200,000 in a bank account. Additionally, he had a folder filled with newspaper clippings. It turned out that since the 1970s, Kenneth Christensen had been collecting articles about the airline where he worked, with the last piece added to the folder just days before the hijacking. Kenneth's brother concluded that this was not a coincidence and attempted to share his suspicions with the FBI. However, he was ignored and turned to a private investigator. The investigator conducted his own research and in 2010 published a book claiming outright that Kenneth Christensen was Dan Cooper. One of his arguments was that he showed a photograph of Kenneth to one of the flight attendants, and she noted that he resembled the hijacker. For the first time in many years, a genuine theory emerged. The book became a hit in the US and attracted the attention of the FBI. However, disappointment soon followed. It was discovered that the house Kenneth bought was not financed in cash, but through a 17-year mortgage, and that the $200,000 came not from the 1970s, but from the 1990s, when he sold part of his land. Moreover, his height and weight did not match the description of the hijacker. Nevertheless, it was due to this book that many began to consider Christensen the actual hijacker. Kenneth became a suspect largely through the recollections of his brother. However, memories are not the only means of finding Cooper. This was something a data analyst from the US Army sought to prove. He analyzed a vast amount of information and concluded that Cooper was someone named William Smith. Smith was also a World War II veteran and had parachuting training. After the war, he worked on the railroad, which could explain how microparticles of rare metals might have ended up on his clothing. In 1970, his company went bankrupt, and the not-so-young Smith lost his pension, potentially providing a motive for the crime. However, this theory is undermined by the fact that Smith did not live near Seattle. He could have learned about the surroundings from a close friend who was from that area. Additionally, a photograph of a boy named Daniel Cooper was found in Smith's yearbook. It is possible that the hijacker took on the name not due to a comic book character, but in honor of a schoolmate who died in the war. An article accusing William Smith was published in 2018, 2 years after the conclusion of the official investigation. This facilitated the release of new books and articles. Now, when facing these new accusations, the FBI consistently responded that they had no new suspects and could not have any, as there was no evidence to charge anyone. This meant that amateur detectives could churn out investigations in bulk, claiming that Dan Cooper could even be a Martian. To conclude, let me share an example of such a claim. A few years ago, news spread, the mystery of Cooper finally revealed. Allegedly, secret FBI documents had been declassified. The mysterious hijacker turned out to be someone named Robert Rackstraw, a retired pilot and former convict. However, a question arose. If these were indeed real secret documents, then why had the hijacker not been caught earlier? In short, Rackstraw was considered a suspect back in the late 70s when he was arrested in Iran for possession of explosives. He was deported to the US and was released on bail, after which he attempted to stage his own death. He rented a plane, flew over a bay, and informed air traffic controllers that he was tired of living and had decided to take his own life. However, a few days later, he was found alive and well in a neighboring city, as was the plane, which Rackstraw had already repainted. This case serves as another example of how a theory connecting someone to the Cooper case may be nothing more than a myth. So, the failed suicide was sent to prison. In the 70s, he was checked for involvement in the hijacking, but he was only 28 years old at the time, which made him unsuitable for the hijacker's profile. His photograph was shown to one of the flight attendants, but she did not recognize him. Nevertheless, in 2016, author Thomas Colbert released a book claiming that Rackstraw was indeed Dan Cooper. Moreover, Colbert sued the FBI to force them to release classified materials related to the Cooper case. The FBI lost the lawsuit and disclosed the materials, but the Bureau refused to make any further comments. At that point, Rackstraw was still alive. And this story did not have a positive impact on him. Suddenly, rumors began circulating about him being a criminal. Although he had been a criminal, he had already served his time long ago. Due to the rumors regarding his involvement in the hijacking, Rackstraw lost his job 2 years before his death. In 2017, he stated that during a conversation with the book's author, he had indeed jokingly referred to himself as Cooper, but it was merely a joke. However, for Colbert, jokes were not taken lightly. He was obsessed with the idea of finding the real Cooper and even traversed the forests where the hijacked plane had flown, claiming to have found part of the parachute and the hijacker's backpack. And also, remember when I read the letter from Cooper? Well, its text had no relation to Rackstraw's life, but Colbert somehow managed to find his supposed encrypted surname in it. Notably, Dan Cooper's jump spurred a series of similar crimes, 15 hijackings that followed the same pattern. They ended with the arrest of the criminals, but the plan involving a bomb and parachute worked flawlessly. This was effective because airport security was not permitted to search passengers' luggage, so it was possible to smuggle anything on board, including a suitcase with explosives or a bag of drugs. New regulations did not appear until 1973. However, not everyone was pleased that security personnel would be rummaging through their belongings, leading to a flood of lawsuits from airlines. But the federal court ruled that this was not a search. It was simply a screening for prohibited items. So it seems to have helped. The following year, there were only 2 hijacking attempts, both by individuals with documented mental health issues. In addition, some minor changes were made to the design of the plane. A device known as the Cooper flap was added to prevent the rear air stairs from opening during flight. A peephole was also installed in the cockpit door so that pilots could see into the cabin. These were the main results of the Dan Cooper case, although many still refuse to put an end to it and dream of uncovering the truth. After the hijacker's case was officially closed, there was a surge of interest in Cooper in America. Today, all 60 volumes of the criminal case are available to the public, and the last major documentary on the case was released last year on HBO. Personally, I tend to stick with the original version put forward by the FBI, which suggests that Dan Cooper, whoever he was, did not survive the jump. There are too many facts that support this version. Adverse weather conditions, low temperatures, and the lack of any evidence of Cooper's presence after the crime. Most likely, there is a simple, sad, and rather uninteresting explanation behind this mystery. However, let's be honest, if Cooper's body had been found a few days later, we would have lost a fascinating story that has been exciting people's minds for several decades. It would be like arresting the real Jack the Ripper and finding out that he was just some crazy homeless person. Boring. But until we have a definitive answer, we can continue to build incredible hypotheses and speculate on the possible outcomes of this unique story. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All the best.